Welcome to Digital Momentum. I'm your host, Mike Ryan from Smarter Ecommerce. This show offers conversational interviews with leaders in digital marketing and e-commerce growth. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Ralph Mayr. Ralph is a deep thinker with an interest, among other things, in e-commerce price optimization. This marks his third appearance on the show, and I'm excited to finally have a one-on-one with him. Seeing the headlines about price inflation over the last weeks and months, I'm dying to pick his brain about how this is playing out in online retail and among consumers. Ralph knows all about pricing strategy, competitor price insights, and dynamic pricing. So let's hear what he has to say. Thanks for joining us today, Ralph. Let's get started here. Why don't you bring us quickly up to speed on inflation in the last few months, or with a longer term view on it? How did we get here? What are some of the root causes of inflation? Which categories are driving inflation?
Yeah. Hi, Mike, and thanks for having me again. And thanks for that interesting question. So there are a couple different explanations that are sort of floating around in the macroeconomic research at the moment for why we're seeing this record inflation. Just to set the context straight, it is definitely a record-breaking level of inflation in many categories, though not in all categories, that we have not seen in roughly a generation. But if you're trying to dissect it a little bit, of course, you see an overly large share of inflation being driven by energy. So oil prices, gas prices, that being in the, I think, 30% ranges now, which is really outrageous compared to things like durable consumer goods, which retailers are usually focused on, which are not as high, of course, as the energy costs.
Yeah, definitely. I was having a look through the latest report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the U.S. data, and if I remember the numbers, let's say plus or minus a couple percentage points. So don't quote me, but it's like 38% in a category like gasoline, and then for these non-oil and non-food commodities, yeah, in the ballpark of like 12%, but for a year. And that's non-seasonally adjusted, but still very, very high nonetheless. So on that question about like how did we get here? What do you see as some of the things that led to now?
Yeah, I think an interesting explanation that is getting more and more traction is the fact that we have to attribute a lot of this actually to the pandemic, but maybe in a way that is not that obvious. So let me take a step back here to walk us through what happened in 2020, essentially. What we've seen there was essentially consumers just not being able to spend in the way that they would like to be spending traditionally. So we had governments around the world subsidizing consumers so that people would not fall flat on their faces, obviously. And many people would have usually spent their available income on things like social gatherings, visiting restaurants, cafes, that kind of stuff.
Travel, events.
Yeah. Exactly, travel, events, all of that, which obviously for many reasons was not possible. And therefore, what happened was that people shifted their spending a little bit on the one side towards savings, but on the other side, just towards buying durable consumer goods. You've had people ramping up their working spaces at home. You had extreme shortages on things like office chairs and laptops and that kind of stuff. Because people were just buying home improvement things, were buying durable goods to set up their personal booking spaces at home. And that, of course, drove demand a lot across a lot of different categories, which combined with the fact that supply chains were starting to break down even more because of things like the lockdowns in China, which led to factories being closed for weeks on end or in months on end in some cases. And the supply chain, or the sort of the logistics side of supply breaking down as well because of people in quarantine and things like that, and travel restrictions. Those two factors combined, so rise in demand for many goods combined with a constriction in supply, that of course drove prices up significantly. So that is one, I would say, prominent explanation that is making a lot of sense if you try to think it through systemically.
Makes a lot of sense.
And the second explanation that is a bit more trying to explain it away, and this is, I think, getting fewer traction these days, is the so-called base effect explanation, where you would look at, where you would say, well, it's obvious that we have a sort of double-digit percentage in inflation today because we are comparing prices to historically low prices. And that was true to some extent when we compared 2021 oil and gas prices, for example, with the 2020 oil and gas prices. If you remember, in early 2020, it was as cheap as never before in my lifetime, at least, to drive a car, because price for gasoline was just at a record low. Again, for that reason that people just had nowhere to go, right? And people did not drive as much. And then if you compare to 2021 or gas prices to the 2020 gas prices, you did see this huge sort of relative difference there, which was actually based on the record low prices before. However, that effect is so we can't attribute what we're seeing today to that effect alone, because just this morning I drove past a gas station, and I think it was a record high gas price, in at least here in Austria, with the 1 liter of super gasoline being above €2.
Yeah.
So you can't attribute that to the base effect, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think the base effect is intuitive, and there's something to it, maybe as a contributing factor, but for sure not in isolation. I mean, another thing that jumps to my mind is that there's a certain extent in the kind of acute shock phase of the pandemic, in the first lockdowns, there were a lot of operational costs that businesses had to shoulder, retailers included, and business model innovation that needed to occur, like getting into things like curbside delivery or pickup, like buy online, pick up in store, and all kinds of processes that changed. And while businesses were in e-commerce, for example, were booming, there's also there were retail branches that were losing revenue, of course, by closures, and there were these business model and operational changes that could have increased operating costs. And I'm wondering if there's an extent where there was a unwillingness and inability to raise prices back then, because it's kind of the wrong thing to do in the middle of a pandemic. It's also illegal. It's called price gouging, I think, and not a good look for brands either. But maybe now it's coming time to raise some prices as well. What do you think about an idea like that?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that in general. We have not seen an increase in consumer prices for especially durable consumer goods, electronics, fashion, that kind of stuff. In the last couple of years, there was really significant. And now, obviously, retailers are trying to, I would assume they're trying to get back on some of the investments that they had to make during the pandemic. As you said, all these innovations that we've seen had to be shouldered up front, basically, by the retailers. And of course, we see that in combination now with rising prices for manufacturing and for logistics, which again combines into this effect of consumer prices just having to go up naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of a vicious circle with the supply chain topics here. I mean, none of us has a crystal ball, Ralph, but now with the invasion of Ukraine placing massive pressure on, for example, Russian energy exports and hitting consumer confidence, how does the inflation trajectory look in the current geopolitical setting?
So that obviously is a very challenging and very tough situation for many people. And I think so if you look back a couple of months ago, predictions from economists were that inflation would go back to normal levels throughout 2022. So if you believe the explanation we talked about before, that this increase or this unnatural increase in demand in 2020 caused some of the inflation due to the imbalance between supply and demand, then the natural thing to expect would be sort of a step back on the inflation side to go back to what it was before. However, now with this war breaking out in Europe, I think that hope is not. So you can't really keep up your hope that that's going to hold true. which is why many economists now are sort of backtracking on their predictions that they made earlier this year. And I think there are two particular things to look at when you think about the war in Ukraine at the moment. One thing is obvious, which is the Russian oil and gas exports. Sure, you've heard a couple of days ago, US President Biden announced that the US would stop all energy imports from Russia as a way of sanctioning Russia for their actions over there. The European Union is not quite there yet, but I assume that also they're at least try to reduce their dependency on Russian oil and gas and reduce imports there, which of course leads to a reduction in overall supply of oil and gas because there's just so many countries who are exporting these things, which obviously will lead to an increase in energy prices again from an already record high level. And that with a level of time delay, obviously, will manifest in price increases everywhere else because you just need some level of the energy prices are sort of a precursor to consumer prices across the board. And the second element to that, and this is one that's a little bit less obvious, but will hit us eventually as well, is the fact that Russia and particularly Ukraine are large exporters of wheat. And just this morning, there was a big announcement on the Austrian news that we have to expect wheat prices across Europe to rise significantly because we can't expect any wheat to be exported from Ukraine in this year at all for obvious reasons. And there's so politicians don't expect a shortage in wheat. However, they expect, of course, the suppliers that remain on the market, particularly those in Central Europe, to increase their prices because of an imbalance between supply and demand.
Yeah, that's interesting. I read that the global wheat surplus, which can be measured in weeks of supply, could be reduced from 4 weeks down to 3 weeks from this conflict, which is pretty alarming thing to see, and could be a coincidence, a survey size of 1 here. But when I was shopping, I noticed that there was no oatmeal left in the grocery store that I was at. And it reminded me a bit of the type of stock oats that we saw back in March and April, May of 2020. It's been a while since I saw something like that occur, but yeah, maybe just a coincidence. Yeah, so thanks for bringing us up to speed a little bit on that broader context. Let's talk through some of the impacts of inflation in commerce, online retail in particular. What have online retailers seen so far? How are they coping?
That's a very interesting question. As we've talked about before, consumer goods, especially durable goods, have not been affected so much by inflation, at least not on the consumer side. And this is where you typically measure inflation. Of course, people just look at average prices for a variety of products that a consumer would pay at any given time and compare these prices over time. And there we have not seen those huge effects as we've seen on oil and gas, obviously. However, we have to expect that consumer prices will be rising there as well. And this is, of course, where many retailers, particularly online retailers, now find themselves metaphorically between a rock and a hard place. Because you have rising costs for logistics, rising costs for the goods you're selling themselves. However, you do not want to propagate these increases in price directly onto your consumers for fear of being not competitive anymore, for fear of scaring away consumers, or for a fear that at least some of the retailers I'm working with have expressed recently. Those are more premium brands or retailers who are selling premium branded goods. And their concern is that consumers would be substituting the premium brands for own brands or for non-branded goods if they increase their prices even further. So that definitely is a challenge there for retailers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think over time we've tended to see a race to the bottom on pricing for online retail in particular. One indicator of that is Adobe has this really interesting report they call it the Digital Economy Index, and one of the things that they look at there is what they call digital purchasing power. So that's kind of how far a dollar or a euro or a pound, in this case, a dollar, because I think it's based mostly on North American data, but how far that will reach you relative to an offline dollar. And we've seen that number, just the purchasing power of online dollars has just gone up and up and up over time, with the implication being that prices are just cheaper and cheaper online. And I think it comes from a variety of factors that we know about, the relative ease of price comparison online, um, and other topics. But in the pandemic, that flattened for the first time, or actually lost purchasing power, a bit of purchasing power relative to the dollar, and it's remained flat and decreased. So I think that's an interesting metric to watch, that, retailers and e-commerce businesses can't offer the level of discounting perhaps that they offered, but maybe they don't want to quite increase the prices yet. It seems to me the implication then, if we're not seeing the inflation that strongly yet, as we might expect on the consumer pricing, then the margin of these businesses must be getting thinner. Is that the conclusion you would draw there too?
To some degree, yes. So first of all, I definitely agree that this digital purchasing power index is a fascinating metric to watch, especially for us here, when we're serving retailers who focus on omnichannel fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the retailers that we are working with have not only are not online pure players, but they have physical stores to some extent. They have catalog businesses. They have mail order businesses. They have sort of a variety of different channels via which they serve their customers. And the question for those people is, what's a satisfying pricing strategy across all these channels? Mm-hmm. And of course, there are sort of pros and cons to each approach that you can take, ranging from splitting your assortment entirely, which is, for example, one very prominent sporting goods retailer that I'm working with has been doing, is that they have a particular assortment only for online, where they apply dynamic pricing and apply steep discounting that they would never want to do offline. But those products are not available in their physical stores at all. Another one that we're working with is currently exploring the possibility of using dynamic pricing across online and offline, using digital price tags in their physical stores, so that they can either apply the same pricing and the same level of discounting online and offline in order not to confuse their customers, but also be more, or have this ability at least, to very mindfully use different pricing online and offline. And of course, this comes down to what your policy then is when somebody walks into your store, pointing to your website on their iPhone and saying, well, what this pair of shoes is like €5 cheaper online. How can that be? And of course, you have to be mindful of what your strategy is there. Another one of the retailers that we're working with states their intention very clearly that their online prices will always going to be cheaper or equal to their offline prices. And thereby, if somebody walks into the store pointing to a cheaper online price, they can say, yes, that is fine. We're going to charge you only for the online price, obviously. But yeah, that is dichotomy between offline and online pricing is definitely interesting to watch.
I like that you raise this omni-channel challenge there. I suspect that over time, as we see omni-channel kind of, if it's on a classic hype cycle, it was maybe overhyped for a while, and then maybe underhyped, and now rising back up to this plateau of productivity, or however it's called, in the famous Gartner hype cycle. But I think that we're really seeing companies actually adopt omni-channel practices and actually figure that out. And I have the feeling that this difference in purchasing power between online and offline could start to diminish through omni-channel, and just having generally a more unified pricing experience. Let's see how it will go.
I would definitely agree with that tendency that the difference will diminish over time, just because you can only argue a price difference to your consumers for so long. So if you're going to sell the same thing offline and online, you're going to have to converge on one price eventually. Question is, however, And this again comes down to understanding who your actual customer is.
Yeah.
If you're catering to a digital native customer personality, then the question is, how do you even transform your physical store experience to best support that personality? So people significantly younger than the two of us, they're uh, even more into purchasing things online, but they might want to experience the product that they're about to buy offline first.
Mm.
But that would mean that you don't have to actually offer any type of pricing offline, because your offline store would convert over time into more of a showroom where people can look at your products, experience them, try them on, try them out. But the expectation would be that they're always ordering them online and always getting the online price then. So I do agree that we will most likely see a convergence of pricing rather than let's say, a widening of gap between offline and online pricing.
Mm.
And the second point you mentioned there, and I just really want to quickly touch on that and not getting into too much detail, is just this unprecedented level of innovation that we've seen in retail starting in 2020 with the pandemic, because that was really the point in time when every type of traditional brick and mortar offline retailer had to offer some kind of new fulfillment option, be that curbside pickup or whatever you want. And thereby just the number of channels that they were serving their customers on just skyrocketed, obviously. And I think we do see that plateau that you were talking about.
Yeah, that plateau in omnichannel productivity, so to say, I'm very optimistic about it. I was somebody who, I don't know, not that long ago was even at the point of rolling my eyes a little bit there with omnichannel, but I think we're coming around to a different place on that. I want to return to the question of margin that I partly raised a minute ago.
And that
How
I totally
can
failed to answer.
no worries at all. Now you get to answer. How can businesses maximize margin and return on marketing investment as a kind of a measurement framework? How can they optimize this in the face of challenges like these huge macroeconomic challenges? And what's the role of data in that?
Right. So that obviously is the billion-dollar question, very literally, in times like these. And I wish I would have a general, easy to apply answer that will work across all types of businesses and in all types of all verticals. However, I think we can, even though we're not going to be able to answer that succinctly in this conversation, there are a few general things that I think retailers can focus on. And the first one, the first element to me really is understanding who your customer is on a very, very deep level, in order to make informed judgments about what pricing they expect, what price increases they will accept to some extent, and for which products particularly, which of your customers or which cohorts of your customers are willing to accept what type of price changes. As you alluded to before, we see margins eroding now with rising prices for logistics, energy, all that kind of stuff. And consumer prices not rising as steeply on the other side. And retailers coping with those diminishing margins, they will have to look very conscientiously at their assortment and say, of the products that I'm offering to my consumers, for which of those does it make sense to reduce prices proportionally to my costs, and for which of them do I have to reduce prices significantly disproportionately? So reducing prices by, let's say, or raising prices by 1% when I have cost increases of 5%, and how do I maximize that out over my entire assortment? The key answer to that, or the key tool to answer that, is obviously better data, having better data about your consumers, about your customers, about who those people are that are buying your products, which combinations of products they're typically buying, how often they tend to buy from you again in the future. And if you take all of that into account, you should be able to make more informed decisions on where on sort of on which parts of your assortment you can make those price increases in order to at least recover some of the cost increases that you also see across your entire product offering.
Well, it's very ambitious what you've outlined there. I mean, it sounds to me like effectively modeling price and demand elasticity and per product or per demographic, having the strategic inputs in place there as well. It's quite ambitious.
Definitely. I mean, we've seen in the past experiments with simplistic demand forecasting models, for example, or very simplistic price elasticity models. And these things do pay off very quickly. However, you run into issues with trying to predict things like the pandemic, for example. So if you have a simplistic demand forecasting model that just looks at, let's say, the last 3, 12, or 24 months of demand, takes that one input signal and tries to extrapolate out what demand is going to be in the next 24 months, obviously you're going to predict increases in demand around holiday season. Of course, you're going to be able to predict sort of seasonal changes or even weekly or monthly changes in demand if you have products that typically get bought more around the weekend rather than a weekday and things like that.
Or payday effects or things like this.
Exactly. However, these models, of course, are not, they're gonna leave you outside in the rain if something like an unprecedented or a rarely precedented event like a major conflict, a pandemic, or things like that happen.
Yeah, I think it's a criticism that it's leveled against these approaches sometimes, is that they're based on historical data, and there are things that happen that are just shocks to the system or just unprecedented in nature. But it doesn't seem to me that precludes having a data-driven approach. I think it just depends what kind of a model you're using or what kind of an approach you're using. And when it comes to an idea like demand shock, just an idea that I was playing around with, I'm wondering if you could take something like consumer confidence and bring this as like a variable or a factor into demand forecasting model. And then you'd have kind of that sense of, okay, my customers react to price changes this way when confidence is high, and maybe they react to price changes a different way when confidence is low. What do you think about an idea like that?
I do love that idea. As I said before, using these simplistic models that just take essentially one variable and trying to extrapolate that in the future, that might work quite well for some scenarios. But the closer you're trying to get with your modeling to the real world, the more data points you will have to take into account. And obviously, consumer confidence is a very interesting one to look at. But you can also bring in other sort of even more further out factors about the macroeconomic environment. So you could look at you could try to bring in additional data points about the macroeconomic environment into your modeling as well. Looking, for example, at stock prices. And if you see, if the model detects that if sort of consumer confidence in combination with stocks is at a certain level, then it is safe to increase prices rather than if things look a bit different. So to me, this all hinges with this might be a very simplistic point of view, but to me it hinges at the question of how much data can you realistically throw at your model. And how closely correlated is that the data that you're throwing at it with what you're trying to predict. And one very interesting thing, I mean, demand forecasting, as we talked about before, is one level of these things to look at. But demand forecasting always is a bit linear and is a bit simplification. And if you add a second dimension to demand forecasting, you essentially end up at price elasticity modeling, where you're not only trying to forecast demand, but you're trying to forecast demand as a function of changing prices. And there you can, again, start with a very simplistic model and just try to sell one product 1 week for 10 euros, the next week for 8, and the next week for 12. Measure how much sales you're generating each of these weeks. Trying to understand or trying to adjust for any external factors that you might see. And then come up with this very simplistic measure of how much willingness is there to pay for that product. Now, of course, that again has the same limitations as we talked about before. But if you combine that with a lot more data points about the macroeconomic environment, about your competition, about general market trends, demand for similar products and things like that, there is a chance for you to get to actually a more realistic, even though not exactly realistic, model of how consumers would react to changing prices. And that, of course, does bring us back to the topic of how can you, as a retailer, cope with inflation. And I think if you are at that level, or at least getting a step closer to that level of really understanding algorithmically the behavior of your consumers, then it's also easier for you to make these price adjustments that you will have to make as a result of rising costs on your end.
If we're talking about price changes, one thing that I'm curious about with dynamic pricing, for example, I mean, how concerned should retailers be about changing prices too often? I've heard this concern raised before, that it could spook customers, confuse customers. It's similar to what we're talking about earlier, with a discrepancy between online and offline prices. There can also be a discrepancy between the price I saw yesterday when it was in my cart and that I was chewing on and thinking about and getting my wallet ready, and I go and now the price is different today, or on whatever time interval.
That is one of the big challenges that we often hear, one of the big concerns that retailers often raise with us when we talk about dynamic pricing. And to me, it ties back really to understanding who your customer is.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about, let's call them Generation Amazon, so people around our age, maybe a little bit younger, who are used to purchasing a lot of things online. For that cohort, it is actually not as surprising to see a different price in the morning as compared to in the afternoon. They might not like it, but they're not totally surprised by it. Now, if I'm thinking about the generation of my mom, for example, who, her non-store-based purchasing experience are based on paper catalogs. And there, obviously, you have a sort of a price guarantee for months. It doesn't matter if you buy the thing in January or if you order it in March, you're going to get the same thing for the same price.
Yeah.
And if you're catering to, so depending on the audience that you're catering to, people are either willing or unwilling, or expecting or not expecting to see those rapid price changes.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And I think there's an extent where Amazon, as you called out, has kind of like pioneered this path a bit. They're unabashedly changing prices dynamically and rather often basis. And I think a lot of people are trained to expect Amazon will give a little notification, 3 items in your basket, change prices. They're transparent about it. It is what it is. Sometimes they went up, sometimes they went down, but I think that potentially it's a bit of an unfounded concern, but it like you said, it probably depends on the demographic and on also the experience that they expect from your brand could be a lot different than the experience that they expect from Amazon too.
Definitely. And there are, of course, different ways to mitigate that. We've seen some of our retailers being extremely careful about that and saying they do apply, so they want to reap all the benefits of dynamic pricing. However, they're just prolonging the pricing phase. So you could do this theoretically on an hourly basis, for example, or even on a just-in-time basis. And we see retailers particularly not doing that and saying, okay, we can do dynamic pricing and we have the ability to do it on an hourly basis, but we are only going to change prices once a week. So that's one way of mitigating it and still at least leveraging the fact that your prices are more data-driven than if you would do it manually. But you don't necessarily have to change prices at a high frequency if you don't want to, or if you believe that your either your products or your consumers aren't particularly suited very well for that type of high-frequency price changes. And of course, you can be more creative about that as well. I mean, I've seen retailers who are very open and very transparent about the fact that they are doing this. And they will even, towards their customers, they will make a statement like, we are changing prices frequently. If we should lower any of our prices within, say, 48 hours after you made the purchase, we're going to notify you, and we're going to make a gift card available to you that you can use for your next purchase, so that you can be sure that you that the price you see now is the so that if we are going to reduce prices, we're going to make that reduction available to you as well, even if you make the purchase right now.
And that's really cool. I like that one a lot. That would give me a lot of peace of mind personally. Ralph, I've got you for a few more minutes, so maybe I just pick your brain on a couple more topics. Did we talk about competition data so far? What do you see? I mean, what do you see in terms of observing competitor pricing strategies, and what are kind of the upsides there, possible downsides? Is it something we should obsess about? Is it something that should just be kind of generally guiding us? What do you think?
That is an interesting question. I do think on a tactical level, retailers have to be very much aware of what's going on in their competitive landscape, but not only in terms of pricing, but also in terms of assortment characteristics of your key competitors, for example, so that you can react also to assortment expansion and contraction of your competitors, identifying which consumer trends they're playing into, so that you can maybe at least replicate it or be aware of what's going on there. So that's the tactical level. On the strategic level, though, I'm very much with the famous quote that's attributed to Jeff Bezos, who famously allegedly said, "Focus on your customers and not your competitors."
Mm-hmm.
So there can be a point at which you're looking so much at what your competition is doing that you're not focusing anymore on what your own business should be doing.
Yeah.
And that definitely is a risk. And the other risk that I just want to point out briefly, I think you touched on that before as well, is if you use competitive information or competition data, particularly for an automated dynamic pricing approach, then of course the risk is that you're running into this race to the bottom, where you're trying to undercut your competitor and they're doing the same thing with you. And you're just, at the end of the day, both of you are losing out. Our advice generally is to use competition data on a very fine-grained level. So on a product-by-product level, obviously, also on a competitor-by-competitor level, but not to use these things as the only influence factor when it comes to dynamic pricing.
Mm-hmm.
But rather taking it as one signal into a more sophisticated approach. Also looking at your own stock levels, at your predicted future demand, at availability, at all that kind of stuff, and just factoring competition in rather than letting your price be only guided by the price of your competition.
Mm-hmm. Wise words. Let's just wrap it up with one last thing. But there's sort of this. I think this gets exposed through something we were discussing lately, this kind of dual role that we're all not just consumers, but also employees. And that we see this trend of the great resignation on the one hand, and there are, in some sectors, it's a bit debated whether there's a real labor shortage or what's occurring, but there's at least nominally some kind of a labor shortage. At the same time as there are these shockingly rising inflation and stuff like this. So it's very different than like kind of a stagflation scenario where you would have low growth, high unemployment, high inflation occurring at the same time. We're in this strange thing where there seems to be a labor shortage and high inflation, but that can be bad too. Can you tell us about that?
Definitely. That is it's a particularly interesting situation to watch at the moment, because as you said, every one of us has a role to play here, both as a consumer who is paying higher and higher prices, but also as an employee of one business or another. And as employees, of course, we're trying to cope for the rising consumer prices that we see by demanding higher wages, and then rightfully so. However, if you think it through systemically, of course, an increase in wages will in turn lead to an increase of costs for the businesses, which they will have to offload to consumers again at some point in time. And so this can lead to a dangerously vicious cycle of increasing prices, increasing wages, and thereby just prolonging this hike in inflation even longer than it would otherwise be. And I think that is one thing that, for example, the Fed, but also the Europeans are trying to mitigate by raising interest rates. So they're trying to put sort of a backstop to this before it gets out of hand. However, I'm curious to see how it turns out and what effects that can have on the overall economic situation.
It all sounds very expensive, Ralph. That's the feeling I'm getting right now. But let's end it on a good note, Ralph. Thank you for joining and sharing all this knowledge with us. And is there anything, anyone you want to shout out, or any thing you want to shout out?
I don't have any particular thing today I wanna shout out to. However, I want to remind all of our listeners to be mindful about the various ways and the various initiatives that are springing up now to help the civilian population in Ukraine. There's, I think, in every town, even in my little town over here, there's a nonprofit being set up in order to gather clothing and baby food and all that kind of stuff for the people in Ukraine. And also to provide housing for the eventual refugees that are going to arrive in Central Europe in the next couple of weeks. So I do want to point that out to people to be extremely open and mindful about ways how we can help, because we touched on that situation sort of superficially in the beginning of our conversation, but we never have to forget the very real human consequences of this, apart from all this abstract economic thinking. So I do want to point out that there are ways that every one of us can help to address the human repercussions of the situation over there, and we should definitely do that as much as we can.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Ralph. And if you're listening to this podcast now, then I hope that you'll please take a moment to act. And if you're listening to the podcast in the future, then I hope you're listening from a more peaceful and calm time in the world than where we're standing right now at the time of recording. And Ralph, if I may be so bold, I would like to plug something for you. Ralph has a really excellent, very thoughtful blog at ralphmayr.com. That's Mayr, M-A-Y-R. So please have a look there. As you can tell from listening to Ralph, he's a very thoughtful and very well-informed person, and his blog is always fascinating. So have a look. And thank you again, Ralph, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sharing it with coworkers, friends, or within your professional network. We really appreciate it. This podcast is produced by Smarter Ecommerce, and you can learn more at smarter-ecommerce.com.